Imagine this. The streets of Mayberry are quiet. Andy's whistling theme drifts in the background, and everything feels timeless. For years, audiences believed the Andy Griffith Show could never really end. After all, reruns made it seem like Mayberry was always just one channel away. But here's the twist, there actually was a final curtain call, and it didn't come from ratings dropping, angry fans, or even a scandal. Nope. The end of Mayberry came down to one man's decision, Andy Griffith himself. He loved playing the wise but gentle sheriff, but even he worried, what if America could never see him as anyone else? What if the badge became a trap? So while Mayberry seemed eternal, behind the scenes, Andy was quietly planning his exit. And that's where our story begins, at the exact moment when America's favorite small town had to face the unthinkable life without Sheriff Taylor. Here's the funny thing about Mayberry. It was almost more alive after the show ended. When the series wrapped in 1968, fans didn't exactly say goodbye. Thanks to reruns, Andy, Barney, and Aunt Bee kept popping up in living rooms across America like they'd never left. In fact, some viewers didn't even realize the show had ended. Kids would come home from school, flip on the TV, and there it was, Sheriff Taylor solving another small-town problem, as if time stood still. Reruns gave the Andy Griffith Show a second life, and in many ways, it thrived even more outside of its original broadcast run. So while Andy himself was ready to hang up the badge, for the audience, Mayberry seemed eternal. The town never aged, the jokes never got old, and every whistle of that theme song felt like home. So if the audience was still in love with Mayberry, why would Andy Griffith ever think of walking away? The truth is simple. He was tired of being Sheriff Taylor. For 8 seasons, Andy played the calm, wise lawman who never raised his voice and always had the perfect answer. But behind the smile, he worried that this one role might trap him forever. Hollywood has a funny way of typecasting. Once you're the Sheriff of Mayberry, you're the Sheriff of Mayberry forever. Andy wanted more. He wanted to test himself in new roles, to try comedy, drama, maybe even film. He knew that if he stayed too long, people might never accept him as anyone but the small-town sheriff with the fishing pole. And for an actor with ambition, that was a nightmare. So while the audience kept whistling the theme song, Andy was quietly thinking, it's time to put the badge away before it puts me away. If Andy was the heart of Mayberry, then Don Knotts' good old Barney Fife was its funny bone. But here's the kicker, Don thought the show was going to end after season 5. So when he got a shiny movie contract, he took it. Suddenly, Mayberry's bumbling deputy packed up his one bullet and headed for Hollywood. The timing couldn't have been worse. Andy had actually considered ending the show after 5 seasons too, but the network smelled gold and convinced him to keep going. The catch: those new episodes were in color. Now, color TV should have been exciting, right? But for many fans, something felt different. The cozy black and white charm was gone, and without Barney's nervous energy to balance Andy's calm, the rhythm of the show shifted. It wasn't bad, it was just different. So by the time Mayberry marched into its later seasons, it was already clear the little town on the small screen wasn't quite the same without its most anxious deputy. When most shows end, you expect fireworks, a tearful goodbye, maybe even a dramatic twist. But the Andy Griffith Show, it went out with more of a polite tip of the hat. The so-called final episode wasn't really a finale at all. Instead, it was a backdoor pilot for a brand new series, Mayberry R.F.D. Rather than wrapping things up, the story quietly shifted focus to a new character, Farmer Sam Jones, and his family. Andy didn't even make a big farewell speech, he just sort of eased out of the spotlight. For fans tuning in, it almost felt like business as usual. One week it was the Andy Griffith Show, and the next week Mayberry simply had a new name on the sign, It was less like a grand exit and more like sliding into the next chapter without missing a beat. And yet, that gentle handoff was very much in the spirit of Mayberry. No drama, no explosions, just life rolling on, the way small towns always do. At first, the handoff seemed to work. Mayberry R.F.D stepped right in where Andy left off. And for 3 straight seasons, it landed in the Nielsen Top 10. On paper, it looked like Mayberry magic hadn't lost its shine. But TV networks are tricky beasts. By the early 70s, executives decided small towns and front porches weren't hip enough anymore. They wanted shows set in big cities, aimed at younger, more educated, urban audiences. That shift became infamous as the rural purge. And just like that, Mayberry R.F.D, a proven hit, was swept off the schedule. It wasn't canceled because fans stopped watching. It was canceled because the networks decided it didn't fit the new image they wanted. So even though Mayberry still had plenty of life left, the powers that be in New York flipped the switch. One of TV's coziest corners was forced to pack up its rocking chair and leave prime time. Here's the curious part. While America in the 1960s was exploding with change, civil rights marches, protests, the counterculture movement, Mayberry felt like it existed in another decade entirely. The town looked more like the 1930s than the turbulent 60s. Folks worried about fishing trips, picnics, and the church choir. Not Vietnam or Woodstock. That was the secret sauce of the show. It gave viewers an escape. 30 minutes in Mayberry meant no shouting matches, no politics, no headlines, just a gentle laugh and a small-town lesson. Some critics later argued that the Andy Griffith Show ignored reality, but for millions of fans, that was exactly the point. When the world outside was noisy and divided, Mayberry stayed calm, steady, and safe. It wasn't meant to mirror the times, it was meant to soothe them. In other words, Mayberry was less about the 1960s and more about the America people wished still existed. Even if you forget every plotline, there's one part of the Andy Griffith Show nobody forgets: that whistling theme. The Fishin' Hole, as it was called, was written by Herbert Spencer and Earl Hagen, and it became the show's signature. Funny thing is, the tune actually had lyrics. Andy himself even recorded a version where he sang about casting a line and taking life slow. But the producers quickly realized why mess with perfection. That simple whistle said everything without a single word. And talk about staying power. Composer Earl Hagen wasn't just a one-hit wonder. He also crafted themes for I Spy, The Dick Van Dyke Show, and The Mod Squad. Yet it's that cheerful whistle, paired with Andy and Opie strolling to the fishing hole, that burned itself into TV history. It was more than a song. It was a promise that for the next half hour, you'd get to visit a place where the biggest problem in the world was whether you packed enough worms for fishing. For all its easygoing charm, things behind the scenes weren't always as peaceful as Mayberry's front porch. Take the so-called mayor, for example. Andy Griffith hated the idea. In real life, a sheriff outranked a small-town mayor, so why should Mayberry need one to Andy? It just didn't make sense, and the very idea became a running battle with the writers. Then there was the laugh track. Andy and Don Knotts couldn't stand it. They felt the show's humor spoke for itself, and canned chuckles only cheapened the moment. Andy even suggested filming before a live audience to capture genuine laughter. But that idea got shot down as too expensive and too complicated for a small-town comedy. So the laugh track stayed, the mayor stayed, and Andy learned to live with both. But those little fights reveal something important even in Mayberry. There were disagreements about what felt real. Andy wanted authenticity. Hollywood wanted formulas. And sometimes, those two visions didn't exactly whistle the same tune. On screen, Andy Taylor was the voice of reason, steady, calm, always one step ahead. Off-screen, Andy Griffith loved nothing more than stirring up mischief. Don Knotts, his closest partner in crime, was often the target. Andy would tap a soda can or rattle a tin just loud enough to throw Don off his lines. And poor George Lindsay, who played Goober, once walked into his dressing room to find raw meat tucked under the cushions, Andy's idea of a good laugh. These pranks weren't mean-spirited. They were Andy's way of keeping the mood light on long shooting days. The cast worked hard, but with Andy around, nobody forgot to laugh. It was almost like Mayberry itself, gentle on the surface, but with just enough surprise to keep things lively. So while America saw the sheriff who solved everyone else's problems, the crew saw the Joker who could turn a boring Tuesday into a comedy sketch all its own. When the Andy Griffith Show quietly bowed out, it did so with a story that felt perfectly Mayberry simple, warm, and just a little bittersweet. The final tale followed Farmer Sam Jones, who vouched for an old army buddy named Mario, fresh from Italy. Mario wasn't alone. Soon his sister and father arrived too, filling Sam's farmhouse with more family than he expected. At first, Sam felt overwhelmed. He even considered asking them to move on. But then Andy Taylor stepped in with the kind of wisdom only Mayberry's sheriff could deliver. He reminded Sam that sometimes what feels like a burden is actually a blessing. Mario's family loved Mayberry instantly. The town welcomed them. And Sam discovered he wasn't losing his space. He was gaining a family. It wasn't a flashy ending. No tears, no big speeches. Just a quiet reminder of what Mayberry was always about: kindness, acceptance, and the belief that every stranger could become a neighbor. When the curtain finally closed on the Andy Griffith Show, it didn't crash down, it drifted quietly, the way a summer evening fades into night. The show never shouted its importance, but its legacy speaks louder than any finale could. Andy Griffith proved that a gentle story could hold America's attention. Don Knotts became a comedy legend. Ron Howard, once just Opie, grew into one of Hollywood's most respected directors. And Mayberry itself turned into more than a set. It became a symbol, a place audiences could return to whenever real life felt too heavy. Even today, decades later, the whistle of that theme song can stop people in their tracks. It reminds us of a time when problems were simple, laughter was easy, and neighbors truly looked out for one another. That's not just television, that's American folklore. So what do you think? Was Mayberry's quiet ending the perfect way to say goodbye? Or did the show deserve a grander send-off? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. And if you enjoyed this trip back in time, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories from TV's golden age, and ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Because next time, we'll dig into one of the most heated debates in sitcom history: the rise and the headache of the laugh track.